The advertisement had run in the county paper for 3 weeks, and in all that time, Caleb Morrow had received exactly one reply, folded twice, with something added at the bottom in a smaller, rounder hand than the one that had written the rest. Cook and housekeeper wanted, the notice had said. Widower with 1 child. Room and board and fair wages. Serious inquiries only. He read the reply again at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold. The woman wrote plainly. Her name was Ellen Hart. She was 29 years old, had kept house for a doctor's family in Missouri until the doctor died, and could cook, mend, garden, and manage a dairy. She asked no questions about him and made no promises she could not keep. It was a sensible letter from a sensible woman, and he would have set it down without a second thought except for the words at the very bottom, pressed close to the edge of the paper as though they had been added in secret. And a mama. Caleb looked up. Across the room his daughter Junie sat on the floor by the stove, mending a sock she had no business mending at 6 years old, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She did not look up at him. But she had been near the writing desk the evening he had penned the advertisement, and she could shape her letters now. And the hand at the bottom of that page was small and round and belonged to no grown woman in Missouri. He said nothing. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and went out to see to the horses, and the whole time the cold March wind cut across the yard, he felt the paper against his chest like a coal that would not go out. The Morrow place sat at the end of a road that saw little traffic, 200 acres of grass, and a creek that ran thin in summer. A house his father had built and a barn that needed more work than Caleb had hours in the day. Since Sarah died, the place had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The curtains she had sewn still hung in the windows. Her garden had gone to weeds 2 summers running because he could not bring himself to turn the soil where her hands had been. The kitchen, which had once been the warm center of the house, had become a place a man passed through to get a plate of whatever he could manage, and Junie had learned to eat quietly across from a father who did not know what to say to her over supper. It was not a home anymore. It was a house where a family used to live, and both of them knew it. And neither of them had the words to name the thing they had lost. The advertisement had been an act of desperation more than hope. The woman who had come out from town twice a week to help had married and moved to Kansas. The bread went stale, and the mending piled up, and Junie's dresses had grown short at the hem, and one evening Caleb had found his daughter standing on a stool at the stove trying to fry an egg for the 2 of them. Her small face fierce with the effort of it, and something in him had broken clean through. A child should not have to feed her father. That night, he had written the notice. He wrote back to Ellen Hart the evening her reply came. He did not mention the words at the bottom of her letter. He told her the wages, told her the train came as far as Cedar Junction and he would meet it, told her the work was honest and the child was good. He signed it and sealed it and walked it to the box at the end of the road under a sky thick with stars. And only when he had let the little door fall shut did he let himself think that he had done it. He had asked a stranger to come into the house where Sarah's curtains still hung. She came on the first Thursday in April. He stood on the platform at Cedar Junction with his hat in his hands and watched her step down from the train. A plain traveling dress the color of dust, a single trunk, and a face that was not beautiful the way the word was usually meant, but was steady and open and tired in the manner of a woman who had learned not to expect much and had made her peace with it. She saw him before he spoke. Perhaps he was the only man on the platform holding his hat like a nervous boy. Mr. Morrow. She said his name the way you would set down something you did not want to drop. Miss Hart. He took the trunk before she could reach for it. Wagon's just there. She looked at him a moment longer than the greeting required, and he had the strange sense that she was reading the same thing in his face that he was reading in hers, that they were two people who had each buried something and come out the other side still upright. Junie was waiting in the wagon bed, wrapped in a quilt, pretending she had not begged to come along. Ellen Hart stopped at the wheel. She did not reach for the child or coo at her the way town women did. She only looked at Junie, and Junie looked back, and something passed between them that Caleb could not name. "You'll be Junie," Ellen said. "You'll be the cook," Junie answered. "I will." Junie considered this with the gravity of a judge. "Can you make the kind of bread that's soft in the middle?" "I can. If there's flour, there's flour." Junie moved over in the wagon bed without being asked, making a space beside her, and patted the quilt. Ellen looked at Caleb. He gave a small nod. He did not entirely understand himself, and she climbed up into the back of the wagon and sat where the child had made room, and the two of them rode the whole way home under one quilt while he drove, and said nothing, and watched the road blur a little at its edges. The ride was an hour and more, and for most of it he listened to the low murmur behind him, the child's questions and the woman's even answers, and he could not have said why the sound of it made his chest ache. It was the sound a house was supposed to make. He had forgotten it could. The house tested her that first week, and she did not flinch. She found the pantry near bare, and the stove temperamental and the well rope frayed to its last strands, and she said nothing about any of it. Only set to work. The stove had a trick to it, a damper that stuck, and where another woman might have fought it for a month, Ellen learned it in a day, and thereafter handled it the way you handle a horse with one bad habit, firmly and without complaint. By the third day, there was bread soft in the middle, and butter she had churned herself, and the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell. By the fifth day she had turned out the pantry and scrubbed it down to the wood and lined the shelves with paper and set the few good jars where they could be seen, and she had gone through Junie's dresses and let down every hem and turned the collars that were worn, so that the child looked cared for again in a way she had not looked in 2 years. She asked Caleb for very little. Twine, once, a new well rope, which he bought in town and felt foolish for not having replaced a year ago. She kept an accounting of every cent she spent from the household money and left it on the table each Saturday, written out in a clean hand, though he had not asked her to, and after the third week he stopped reading it and only moved it aside. Because a man does not need to audit a woman he has already decided to trust. He kept his distance, he took his meals and thanked her, and went back out to the work that never ended, and if he lingered a moment in the doorway some evenings watching her braid Junie's hair by the lamp, he told himself it was only that the light was warm and the house had been cold a long time. Junie did not keep her distance at all. The child took to following Ellen from room to room, a small, quiet shadow, handing her clothespins, holding the flour scoop, learning to set a table properly for the first time in 2 years. Caleb watched it happen and did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. He knew what it was to lose a woman from this house. He did not want to watch his daughter learn that grief a second time if Ellen Hart decided the work was too hard or the place too lonely and took the train back east. But Ellen showed no sign of leaving. And Junie, who had gone so still and old after her mother died, began to laugh again in the evenings, a sound Caleb had almost forgotten the shape of. He heard it from the barn one dusk, the child's laugh carrying clear across the yard, and he stood with a currycomb in his hand and listened until it stopped. And then he stood a while longer. It was Junie who set the third place. They had eaten at the two ends of the table that first week, Caleb and Ellen, with Junie between them, and Ellen had always laid her own place last and eaten quickly and risen first to clear, as a hired woman does who has not been told she is anything more. But on the second Sunday Caleb came in from the barn and found the table set for 3, plates squared, the good jar of preserves in the center, and Ellen's place laid not at the far end where she had been putting it, but at the near corner close, in the spot where a wife would sit. He stopped in the doorway. Ellen came in from the kitchen with the bread and saw the table and went still. "I didn't set that." She said it quietly. "I set my place at the end. I always do." Junie was already climbing onto her chair. "I moved it." She said it plainly, the way she said everything, and reached for her napkin. "You sit here now. It's better." Caleb looked at the plate at the near corner. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him with a 6-year-old's terrible directness, waiting to see if he would move it back. He did not move it back. He hung his hat on the peg and pulled out his own chair and sat, and after a moment Ellen set down the bread and took the place at the near corner, and if her hand shook a little as she smoothed the napkin over her lap, no one said anything about it. He asked the blessing the way he always did, plain and short. And when he said the words about daily bread, his voice caught on nothing, and yet caught anyway, and he opened his eyes to find Junie beaming at the table as though she had built the whole house herself. He said nothing. But that night, lying awake in the room that had been his and Sarah's, he stared at the ceiling a long while and understood that a line had been crossed that he had not drawn, and could not now undraw, and was not certain he wanted to. The barn came near to taking him in the second week of the thaw, and it was Ellen who saw the danger before he did. A section of the loft floor had rotted through the winter, and Caleb had meant to get to it, and had not, and one morning he climbed to pitch hay down and the boards gave under his boot. He caught the beam and hung there, and got himself back, but it shook him. And when he came in white around the mouth, Ellen took one look and did not fuss. She only asked what had happened, and when he told her, she went out the next day while he was mending fence and walked the whole barn floor herself, testing the boards with her heel, and she came back with a list written out plain. Every soft place marked, so that he would not have to find them one at a time with his weight. It was not a showy thing. But it was the sort of thing a partner does, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The trouble came in May, the way trouble does, wearing the face of a neighbor. There was a note held against the ranch. Caleb's father had borrowed against the land in a bad year and died before he cleared it, and the note had passed to a man named Harlan Voss, who owned the feed store and half the mortgages in the county and wanted the Morrow Creek frontage badly enough to have offered for it twice. The note came due in June. Caleb had meant to pay it out of the spring calves, but the spring had been cold and the calves few, and when he sat down with his ledger at the end of the month, the figures would not come right no matter how he moved them. He sat over that ledger 3 nights running, and every night the number at the bottom of the page was $40 short of the number Voss would want, and no amount of staring at it made the columns kinder. He did not speak of it at the table. But Ellen kept a house too closely to miss a man going gray around the eyes, and one evening after Junie was asleep, she found him at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the lamp low. "You've been carrying something for a week." She did not sit. She stood across the table with her hands folded, a woman who had earned the right to ask and knew it. "If it touches this house, I'd rather know it than guess at it." So he told her. The note, the calves, Voss and the creek frontage, the number at the bottom of the page that he was $40 short of. Ellen listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet a moment. Then she went to her room and came back with a small cloth purse and set it on the table between them, and it landed with the particular soft weight of coins. "Dr. Algis paid me fair for 8 years. She said it evenly. I never had much to spend it on. It's $41. She pushed it an inch toward him. "Take it." Caleb looked at the purse and did not touch it. "That's your going home money." "It is." "Then I can't take it." That's the money that means you can leave if you want to. Ellen looked at him across the low lamplight, and something in her face gave way. Just slightly, the way ice gives on a pond in the first warm week. I know what it is. Her voice was low. That's why I'm putting it on the table. He did not take it that night. His pride would not let him, and something deeper than pride, a fear of being beholden to a thing that might yet walk away. But he did not forget that she had set it down. A woman does not offer up the very money that lets her go free unless she has quietly decided she is not going. He found the $40 another way. In the end, he had his father's rifle, a fine long gun that a man in town named Pettibone had wanted for 3 years and asked after every time they met, and he had a good saddle besides, hand-tooled, worth more than he had ever admitted. He took them both to town on a gray Tuesday and sold the rifle to Pettibone for $25 and the saddle to the liveryman for $18. And it cost him more than money to hand them over, because the rifle had been his father's hands and the saddle had been 10 years under him, and a man's tools are a kind of memory. But he did it without a word of complaint. And he rode home on a borrowed saddle blanket, and he said nothing to Ellen about where the money had come from. He paid Harlan Voss on the courthouse steps the second week of June. Voss counted the money twice, slow, hoping to find it short, and when it came out right his jaw tightened with the particular disappointment of a man watching a creek he had wanted slip out of his reach. "You had help with this," Voss said, not quite a question, his eyes going narrow. Caleb took his receipt and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, in the same pocket where the letter had ridden that first March morning. "I had my own 2 hands," he said, and walked down the steps and left the man standing there. The land stayed. Ellen's purse stayed in her room, unopened, which mattered to him more than he could have said. He thought that was the end of the danger. He was wrong about where the danger truly lay. It came from town, as such things do, carried on the tongues of women who had nothing better to carry. A cook was one thing. A young widow, living unmarried in a widower's house, sitting at the near corner of his table, braiding his daughter's hair, that was another, and by midsummer it had a shape and a sound in the county, and the sound reached the Morrow place the way smoke reaches you before the fire, through the minister's wife, who came to call with her mouth full of concern and her eyes full of something else. Ellen received her politely, and gave her coffee, and answered nothing, and when the buggy had rattled back down the road, she stood a long while at the window, with her back to the kitchen, her hands still in the dishwater gone cold, and Caleb, watching from the doorway, saw her shoulders and understood that the visit had cost her something she was not going to name. That night she told Caleb she thought it might be best if she went back east. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, standing by the stove with her hands wrapped in her apron. I won't be the reason this family's name is spoken in that tone. Her voice was steady, and that was the worst of it. Junie has to grow up here. You have to live here. I don't. I'll stay till you find someone. Then I'll go. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He had 100 things to say and not one of them would come to his tongue. And he stood there in his own kitchen mute as a stone, while the woman he had somehow come to need told him she was leaving to protect him. He should have spoken then. He knew it even as he failed to. But grief had taught him that the mouth is a dangerous instrument, and that the things a man loves get taken whether he speaks or not, and so he only stood there, and Ellen took his silence for agreement, and turned back to the stove so he would not see her face. Neither of them knew Junie was on the stairs. The child had come down for water in her nightgown and stopped in the dark of the stairwell with the cup forgotten in her hand, and she had heard all of it. The going east, the finding someone, the leaving, and where a grown person would have weighed and worried and said nothing, Junie did what children do. She acted. In the morning there was a paper on Ellen's place at the table. Caleb saw it first. He had come in early, and there it was, laid square on Ellen's plate at the near corner, a single sheet torn from the schoolbook Ellen had been teaching her from, and on it, in the small, round, careful hand of a child who has been practicing her letters all spring, were 4 words. Please be my mama. Under them she had drawn a house, and 3 figures outside it, holding hands, one tall, one middling, one small, and a sun in the corner with all its rays, and a dog, though they did not own a dog, which Junie had apparently decided was a thing the picture required. Ellen came in from the kitchen with the eggs and saw Caleb standing over the paper and stopped. He turned it so she could see. He watched her read the 4 words, watched her see the house and the 3 figures and the sun and the dog they did not own, and he watched the steadiness she wore like armor come apart all at once, quietly, without a sound, her hand rising to her mouth. Junie came down the stairs then in her nightgown, her hair unbraided, her chin set for a fight the way her father set when the note came due. She marched to the table and stood between the 2 adults and looked up at Ellen with her whole small fierce heart in her face. I heard you say you'd go. Her voice wobbled and held. I don't want to cook. Cooks go away. She reached up and took a fistful of Ellen's apron, the way she had that first day patted the quilt, claiming a space. I want a mama. I picked you. I already picked you. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside a meadowlark ran through its whole bright song and stopped. Ellen knelt down. She knelt right there on the kitchen floor so her eyes were level with the child's, and she took Junie's small hands in both of hers, and when she spoke her voice was not steady at all, and she let it not be. You can't pick a mama, sweetheart, she said it softly. It's not yours to pick alone. There's your pa to think of. And Junie, 6 years old and certain as sunrise, turned and looked at her father. So did Ellen. And Caleb Morrow, who had stood mute the night before and let this woman offer to walk out of his life to spare his name, found that the words which would not come in the dark came now. In the plain light of an ordinary morning, with his daughter's hand fisted in Ellen's apron and a child's drawing of a house on the table between them. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who could. He crossed the kitchen instead and took his hat off the peg where it hung, and he did the thing he had done every working morning of his married life and had not done once in the 2 years since Sarah died. He hung it back up, and then he took down Sarah's shawl from the second peg, the gray one that had hung untouched by the door for 2 years, because he could not give it away and could not bear to see it worn, and he held it out to Ellen across the kitchen. It gets cold by the creek in the evenings. His voice was rough and low, and it did not waver. You'll want something to walk out in, if you're staying. It was not a grand thing to say. But Ellen knew what the shawl was. She had dusted around it for 4 months and never once moved it, because a house tells its griefs to the woman who keeps it, and she knew whose shoulders it had last warmed and what it cost him to lift it down. She rose from the floor, she crossed the kitchen, and she took the shawl from his hands, and in the taking her fingers stayed a moment against his, and neither of them pulled away. I'm staying, she said. Junie let out a whoop that startled the meadowlark into flight and threw both arms around whichever leg was nearest, which happened to be Ellen's, and held on. They were married in the little church in town before the leaves turned, on a bright cold Saturday, with the same minister's wife in the second pew, wearing an expression she could not quite settle, and half the county come to see the thing they had gossiped about turn out to be nothing but a family after all. Junie carried a fistful of the last asters from the ditch by the road because Ellen's garden was not yet hers to cut from, and she stood between the 2 of them at the front and did not let go of either hand through the whole of it. Ellen turned the soil in the spring. She did not ask whose garden it had been. She only asked Caleb one evening where the sun fell longest, and he showed her, and she nodded, and the next morning she was out there with the spade before the dew had lifted, breaking the 2 years of weeds, and Caleb stood at the window with his coffee and watched her do the one thing he had never been able to do, and found that it did not hurt the way he had feared. It felt like the ground being given back to the living. They got the dog that summer because Junie had drawn one, and a promise is a promise. It was a brown mongrel pup from a litter at the feed store, of all places, bought under the sour eye of Harlan Voss, and Junie named it Sun for reasons she would explain to no one. On an evening in that first married autumn, Caleb came up from the barn in the blue dark and stopped at the edge of the yard the way he had that first April and looked at his own lit windows. Inside, at the near corner of the table, Ellen sat with Junie leaned into her side, the two dark heads bent over a schoolbook, the lamp gold between them, the pup asleep with its chin on the child's foot. Sarah's shawl, which was Ellen's shawl now, hung warm around her shoulders against the cold that came down off the creek in the evenings. He stood in the dark a moment longer, a man looking in at everything he had. Then he crossed the yard and lifted the latch and stepped inside, into the light and the smell of bread soft in the middle, and Junie looked up from her book and said, "Pa, Mama says I can read the whole page myself now," and Ellen looked up too and did not say anything at all, only moved the lamp a little to make room at the table, the way a child had once moved over in a wagon bed and made room under a quilt. And he sat down in his place among them and stayed.